This time it's the AMC two-strokes. Our story starts in the early days following World War II. AMC was going around at this time buying up a lot of smaller companies, and so came the opportunity to purchase James and Francis Barnett motorcycles. Both had really struggled to get going post-war, so AMC took the opportunity and purchased them both. At this time, Francis Barnett and James were the two biggest customers by far of Villiers engines. The AMC management weren't too happy with this, because they felt that Villiers were a little bit dictatorial when it came to engine development. They seemed to have a monopoly on customer engines because companies like Jap had folded during the war, or at least had been taken over by Villiers. Also, AMC felt that this was costing them too much money, so AMC decided that they would develop their own two-stroke power units, and thus break away from the reliance from their companies, at least, from Villiers engines. They wanted to develop something that was higher performing, more modern than the Villiers engines, a bit different, and also, hopefully, cheaper to make. So to develop their new power unit, they brought in Italian Vincenzo Piatti. Piatti had already had a company of his own which had developed a rather aesthetically challenging and yet technically interesting scooter in the late 40s and early 50s. He'd also developed an engine in the immediate post-war period for attaching to push bikes. This was very popular in Italy and is actually how Ducati had got going. Unfortunately, issues started right from the very beginning of the project. AMC didn't really want to shell out a lot of money on the development of a humble two-stroke. Also, Piatti was told that he had to develop an engine which could be built down to a cost. In the end, what he developed was fairly interesting and certainly different, because by this point, pretty much all two-strokes worked along the same basic principles. They all had transfer ports that fitted in behind the line with the barrel. In other words, there was a wall between the transfer port and then there would be a window further up the cylinder, as you can see on the film. And they all used flat top pistons because they incorporated loop scavenge into their gas flow. Piatti, however, was slightly different. Instead of using walled up transfer ports, the transfer ports were open, so they were effectively just grooves cut into the barrel. This made them much cheaper to machine. To help guide the gases, the piston was developed in a rather interesting way and was a sort of halfway house between an old-fashioned deflector piston like in a Scott and a conventional flat-top piston. There were two ramps cast into the top of the piston which helped guide the gas flow around the cylinder. Unfortunately, what this meant was that the piston, because of this unusual casting, was rather heavy when compared to a traditional piston for a two-stroke that you would find in a Villiers or in any modern Japanese or later Japanese two-stroke. As a result, the engines did not rev particularly highly, and they certainly were not performance engines. Perhaps an even bigger problem was the fact that AMC had very little, and to be honest, virtually no experience in the construction of two-stroke engines. As a result, the build quality on the engines was not fantastic, and this really compounded the reliability problems that the design created. As a result, the engines had a very poor reputation for reliability. The first engine produced was a 175cc single, and this ran alongside Villiers engines for a short time while other capacities were developed. Eventually the engines would run from 150 all the way up to a 250cc, and the performance of the engines was fairly modest throughout. The heavy piston design meant that trying to extract high performance from the engine was a non-starter. It did, however, work fairly well in trials, and a number of trials models did work fairly successfully with this engine. However, if you wanted road race type performance, this was not going to be the engine. Initial sales in the late 50s were fairly good, but it didn't take long before the reputation of the bike for poor reliability and its fairly modest performance meant that sales began to tail off after about 2 or 3 years, and as we got past 1960, the sales began to plummet. AMC continued to struggle to get the reliability right on their engines. As a cost-cutting exercise, they closed down the Francis Barnett factory and moved them in with James. The result of this was basically badge engineering. From that point onwards, both machines would be identical from James and Francis Barnett. They would just be a different colour or have a different badge. To their credit, a lot of work was put in updating the styling of the machines, and this was done to great effect. Some of the machines look really quite modern, at least by mid-60s styles. The problem was the chassis were still basically old-fashioned and those Piatti engines were still very unreliable. In the end, AMC would embarrassingly have to turn to Villiers to assemble their engines for them, and Villiers would do a much better job. From that point onwards, the reliability of the machines did improve. However, although reliability was now much improved, the performance of the engine was never going to be anything to write home about. So when they needed to develop some sports models, they had to go back to Villiers and use their twin-cylinder 2T and 4T units. By 1966, it was all over for AMC, and Francis Barnett and James were taken down with them. Whether this was ultimately down to the use of the Piatti engines is a matter for some debate, I suppose. But they certainly didn't help. Perhaps even more frustratingly, they really didn't achieve what they'd set out to do. They didn't outperform and they didn't break the monopoly of Villiers. What they did manage to do was probably bankrupt Villiers too, because with the loss of their two biggest customers, it was always going to be difficult going from then on for Villiers. Somewhat ironically, the two companies would be married together in a new conglomerate formed by manganese bronze. And that really was the end for the Piatti engine. It really wasn't a great engine, but does that mean that they wouldn't make a good buy these days? For the classic motorcyclist, they probably make a reasonably good buy actually today. They do give modest performance, but as long as they're ridden with some mechanical respect, as long as they're not thrashed around in the way that the teenagers of the 1960s would have done, then they should prove reasonably reliable. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, thank you very much for watching.